Today we're going to be talking about solving quadratic equations using square roots. So let's say that you have a house and you need to do some work on that house, or you need to reach a spot on that house that's too far off the ground for you to just reach. So you need to bring in a ladder. Let's say that that ladder is 16 feet tall and you need to be able to reach a spot 14 feet off the ground. How far away from the base of your house do you need to put the base of the ladder in order to reach that 14-foot height? Does this shape look familiar? How about if I put in these markings? This is a right triangle, correct? What did you have to do in the past? What did you use in the past when you needed to be able to find a missing side length of a right triangle? Well, we had to use Pythagorean theorem. Remember that? If you don't remember what Pythagorean theorem is, please go to Khan Academy or my YouTube channel, do a search for Pythagorean theorem, and then come back to this video later. Before we can use Pythagorean theorem, remember we need to determine which side is the hypotenuse. Remember, hypotenuse is the longest side length. It's also the side that's opposite the right angle. The other two sides are called legs. They're the ones that actually touch the right angle, and the hypotenuse is across from it. So we're going to name those A, B, and C. Remember, it really doesn't matter except that the hypotenuse always has to be C. Pythagorean theorem says that in any right triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So I'm going to put in my measurements. A is my unknown, b is 14, and c is 16. So now I have x squared plus 14 squared equals 16 squared. I can actually calculate the 14 squared and the 16 squared, so that's what I'm going to do next. In order to solve for x, solve for my missing side length, right? I'm going to have to subtract 196 from both sides. The 196's are going to cancel, and I'm going to end up with x squared equals 60. So here's my conundrum, right? How do I undo a squared so that I can just have x by itself? We've done this before already this year. Do you remember how we did it? What's the opposite of a square? A square root. In order to get x from an x squared, I have to take its square root. Remember, when we're solving equations, what I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So if I square root x squared, I have to square root 60 as well. That's going to give me square root of x squared is just x, and square root of 60, rounding to 2 decimal places, is about 7.75 feet. That's how far away from the base of the house I need to put that ladder. A quick reminder about square roots. Remember, a square root is a number times itself that equals that perfect square. Well, 4 times 4 is 16, but today I need to remind you that negative 4 times negative 4 equals 16 too. So when I take the square root of 16, which one do I pick, 4 or negative 4? Because they both work, right? They're both a number times itself that's going to give me 16. Well, the answer today is both. Today I'm going to focus on both the positive and the negative root of a number. So if I'm asked for the square root of 16, I'm going to say today that it's both 4 and negative 4. There's a shortcut in writing that, by the way. I can say the square root of 16 is plus minus 4. This little symbol means that that includes positive 4 and negative 4. So please make sure that that gets down in your notes today. It's going to be important for us, and we will have a quiz on that next time we meet. So let's take a look at our first example. Remember, my ultimate goal here is to solve for x. I'm trying to find the missing number. In order to do that, I have to isolate x. And my first step to do that is to isolate x squared. If I can isolate x squared, I can find x. So to isolate x squared, I'm going to have to get rid of that minus 5 by adding 5 to both sides. I'm going to end up with 2x squared equals 200. To get rid of the 2 in front of the x squared, I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And I'm going to end up with x squared equals 100. Now that x squared is by itself, then I can focus on isolating x. Again, how do I get an x from an x squared? I square root. What I do to one side, I have to do to the other. Square root of x squared is x, and square root of 100 is both positive 10 and negative 10. So I'm going to say that x is positive and negative 10. Let's try that again. I want to solve for x. Remember, that's my ultimate goal here. Notice I do have a squared in my equation. That makes this quadratic. My first goal, of course, is to isolate x squared. In order to do that, what am I going to have to get rid of first? First, we're going to have to add 10 to both sides to get rid of our constant. That's going to leave me with 4 times x plus 3l squared equals 4. Then I need to get rid of my coefficient, so I'm going to divide both sides by 4. That's going to leave me with x plus 3 quantity squared equals 1. Now, this part's a little bit tricky. Since it's not just x that's squared, this is a little bit of a different problem. Since there's nothing else on the left-hand side of my equation that's not squared, this is where I would take the square root, because the next thing I need to undo is this squared. So this is the point where I'm going to take the square root. What I do to one side, I have to do to the other. Remember that taking the square root on the left-hand side simply gets rid of the squared. Everything else stays put. So on the left-hand side, I just get x plus 3. And on the right-hand side, square root of 1 is positive 1 and negative 1. Since x is not alone yet, I need to do one more little piece of simplifying. Notice how on the right-hand side I have 2 numbers here, positive 1 and negative 1, so I'm going to split this up. I'm going to make one of them I'm going to make one equation using the positive 1 and one equation using the negative 1, and I'm going to treat them like 2 separate equations. In both equations, I'm going to have to subtract 3 from both sides. And I'm going to get, on the left-hand side, I'm going to get x equals negative 2. And on the right equation, I'm going to get x equals negative 4. These are both answers to my equation. Negative 2 would work if I put it in for x. And negative 4 would work if I put it in for x. Please make sure to take a few minutes to look at this equation, pause the video, go through the steps again if you need to, and make extra sure that this gets written down in your notes. Let's go through one more example. Again, I need to solve for x. Since I have a squared, that makes this quadratic, and I need to isolate x squared. Instead of just x squared, I'm going to say isolate whatever it is that's squared. So to do that, I need to get rid of my constant by subtracting 15 from both sides. That's going to leave me with x minus 1 quantity squared equals negative 16. There's nothing left on the squared side of my equation that's not squared. The next thing I need to undo is the squared. In order to do that, I have to take a square root. What I do to one side, I have to do to the other. On the left-hand side of my equation, on the squared side, the square root and the squared simply cancel each other out, and I get x minus 1. On the right-hand side of the equation, I get positive and negative square root of negative 16. This was one of the very first things we did this year, was square rooting a negative number. Remember a little thing called imaginary numbers? Well, there's two schools of thought on this idea. One school of thought says you can't take the square root of a negative number. The other school of thought says, yes, I can. It's just an imaginary number. So we're going to go through and remind ourselves of both. So in order to solve this, again, there's two schools of thought here. In order to get x by itself, of course I'm going to have to add 1 to both sides to get x by itself. So I'm going to get x equals the positive and the negative square root of negative 16 plus 1. Notice how the plus 1 is not underneath the radical, so I'm not taking the square root of that plus 1. So if I were talking imaginary numbers, square root of 16, remember, is the square root of 16 times the square root of negative 1. Square root of 16 is 4. Square root of negative 1 is I. So positive negative square root of negative 16 gives me positive negative 4i. We can go back and review that in class if we need to. And then I have to put the plus 1 on the end. Seeing as how this is two different 4i's, one positive, one negative, remember our complex numbers? I have 1 plus 4i and I have 1 minus 4i. The other school of thought simply says there is no real solution here because this does not give me a real number. It does give me imaginary numbers, but it does not give me real numbers. In your book today, in your assignment, you're going to simply write the no real solution side. If you have to take the square root of a negative number, it does not give you a real number, so just simply write no real solution. Remember, please, to write down definitions and examples in your notebook. We will be having a notebook check next class period and a quiz on this video. So bring your notes to class and I will see you then. Remember to write down any questions you have so that we can go through them in class. And I will see you later. Have a fantastic day.